countdown. Oh, we are live. And welcome to our 2024 Some of Our Favorite Historical Games panel. I am joined by the ever wonderful Dan Thurot of Space Biff, the blog we're all reading, and then also the Space Biff Spacecast, his wonderful podcast as well, and by Liz Davidson of Beyond Solitaire fame, Cancel Queen, designer of Queen of Spies and the upcoming Night Witches as well. Welcome to both of you. I just wanted to also preface, sadly, we will not be joined by Candace Harris this morning. She is feeling a little bit under the weather still. So we're going to try the best to manage on our own without any kind of adult supervision. I think it's okay. Sometimes kids can be their own sitter. That's what I think. But that's as a person without children. So take that with a pillar of salt.
The inmates are running the asylum.
The inmates are running the asylum. So yeah, I thought nice little icebreaker question. Rather than asking you both who your favorite Confederate general is, maybe instead we'd start with something along the lines of, are there historical games that portray poor history but deliver an enjoyable experience that you keep coming back to? And I thought for this question, I would start with Dan.
Okay. So I was trying to think of my favorite Confederate general. And I was like, which ones got killed quickly? Let's see. Anyway, so the question was the experiences I keep coming back to. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. In thinking about this topic, I realized that I don't know what year some things come out because I play a lot of games in preview, and also I play a lot of games late. But I'm pretty sure this was a 2024 release and pretty squarely. But the historical game that I played the most of this year that I do keep coming back to and I think is utterly wonderful is Matilda Simonson's Pax Penning. And not only is this a game I keep coming back to, it was my single favorite game of last year, including, yes, better than Arcs, which I know Cole is here. I'm so sorry, Cole, but it's actually the second year that something Cole has designed has been swept by Matilda's game. So I love Pax Penning.
Liz?
Okay, I'm gonna take this in a different direction. So you said that not great history.
Yeah.
But I keep going back to it. So it's not posed anytime near here, but I've been having a blast on Homo Ludens playing Legion of Honor with Fred and Joe and Pierre. And I mean, it's got some Napoleonic window dressing. I wouldn't say it's like a deeply historical game that's really communicating anything serious about history. But damn, is it fun to like get into stupid fights and imagine like whether you're gonna let Napoleon sleep with your girlfriend. Trying to get glory. Like we've made up all these dumb backstories for each other. God, it's a blast. I've been really, really enjoying it. It's so much fun. And yeah, so actually that would be it. Like if you want to, it's like not great history, but I'll just keep playing it because it's fun. I'm gonna say it's got to be Legion of Honor because I'm already really excited to play again.
And this is something I would assume Fred would do, but would you say that as a group, you're all kind of turning it into a Napoleonic soap?
Like a soap opera?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because what else would you do?
Yeah.
Just call it the Young and the Rebellious.
The Young and the Rebellious. That's really good.
General Field Hospital.
You might want to put that in your back pocket just just in case. When it's like, what's Liz's next project? Oh, she and David are working on a Napoleonic dating sim. It's like, oh, okay. Like,
actually,
oh
okay,
my
if I
God.
could make something based on Legion of Honor, I would love to mess with the system a little bit and create Legionary of Honor and make like a Roman version
Okay.
and like just pick different time periods for that. That'd be hilarious.
No, that sounds pretty
That's what I would
slick.
play. Yeah.
You know, I'm always reminded, like Ananda Gupta once remarked that he felt like a lot of the appeal to war gamers of Napoleonics was just their uniforms. Like it's just basically like clothes. And I kind of see a little bit of that in so much as, you know, when you're thinking about fashion into war, but make it fashion. It's like until Battle of Versailles, like maybe the best we really have is just
Well, that's literally
Napoleonic
war,
game.
make it fashion.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely.
So what is there going to be? Yeah, I feel like we need more like fashion fight games. I think that's a great idea. I want like a RuPaul's Drag Race board game as well.
Like a Drag Race Death Race mashup would be really nice, wouldn't it?
Oh my God.
I don't know. I always want something kind of Death Racy, Mad Maxy. Like I've been this Fury Road design that I just want to do for friends because it'd just be really fun to like, you know, get to the green place, turn around. Like I just think that seems like a really fun, fun design challenge. But
what's your game, Dan B?
Trashy game. You know, I play Junta once a year. I don't know if people are very familiar with Junta. Pretty distasteful.
Junta,
So I have the West End Games version that I probably purchased when I was like 11 or 12 with my own money. But it's basically a game about fictitious island in the Caribbean that is run by a dictator, and each player plays a family that is got a cabinet position that they occupy, and they take turns being the president. And the president, every single turn, is drawing from a pile of foreign aid. They draw bills like face down. They're like $1, $2, or $3 million, and then they distribute it amongst their cabinet. So they are embezzling the foreign aid and then basically dividing it amongst cabinet members. And only the president gets to see the bills that are being drawn up for the budget, and then they vote on it. And if people are unhappy with their budget, they may have a coup and then try to seize the presidency or even assassinate one another for the money in their pockets. But the object of the game is to get as much money into your Swiss bank account before the end. So even as family members, you're kind of disposable. You know what I mean? It's all about getting the family account packed with
I want to play
money.
this now.
It's pretty ridiculous. It's very silly. But at the same time, I think the reason why it kind of works is in a lot of categories, it sort of checks many similar boxes to Republic of Rome, but nobody gets upset or takes it very seriously. And then also, we just end up drinking, you know, rum and smoking cigars most of the day. So my backyard smells absolutely atrocious. People look like they're turning green by about 4 p.m. But some of us have made a series of life choices where that's acceptable, and for others, they only have this one game a year. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So that would probably be my most kind of trashy, not really historical game, but definitely historically informed game somewhat.
All right.
So when we talk about the qualities of maybe a good historical game, what is it that draws both of you to historical games in general, would you say? Like, what are some of the virtues of historical games that makes them somewhat distinct when they're good?
They give me much more range to be pedantic. And no kidding. No. What I actually okay, so actually this is a real turn that my board gaming career took, right? Career such as it is. Because I was just a solo gamer who was reviewing everything, and my interest got more and more and more and more historical over the years. I think that part of it is that for me, I think historical games give me an anchor point that makes it more interesting for me to talk about the design, because I can more easily assess whether a game is reaching its goal or not. Sort of like how you asked, right? What's a historically informed game that's not really hitting the mark historically? I feel like if you're looking at a historical game, it's easier to talk about its merits in some ways because there is a template that it's supposed to be matching in some way. And by choosing to interpret history in one way or another, like I feel like you learn a lot about whoever designed the game. There's just I think they're more revealing because, like, what historical topic did you choose? How did you choose to represent the world? And I can see more about your choices because you were trying to represent something that was real enough that everybody could have like looked it up and had an opinion. So like your opinions and like yourself are just a lot more out there. And also it's easier to argue about them, which I enjoy doing. So
being able to be pedantic and argue. I just went right for the kind of your central thesis. I feel like I just wanted to highlight that in a way that spoke to your academic background. That makes sense.
Yes, actually, I think getting back to the historical games is healing for me because after I left academia, it was like I almost didn't want to touch it for a long time, and my willingness to do it, I think, was a sign that I had gotten over my ivory tower trauma and was like ready to be that person again.
I can relate to that despite not having that kind of an academic background. It's not really like a trauma, but I think about like how even people get into design to kind of resolve certain issues that they might have with competition or gaming. And maybe it kind of frames joy a little bit. It kind of puts joy front and center in gaming, I think, sometimes. So that's kind of cool. Dan, historical games, why? Why do they think they're so great, huh?
I don't know. That's a really hard question because it demands a degree of introspection that I feel I lack. It's just for me, in a way, it's more like science fiction. It's the time machine nature of it. I'm just so fascinated by the idea that we can brush fingers with the past sometimes. I was raised in a culture that was frankly very obsessed with the notion of like tradition and heritage and where you come from. And to a degree that most people actually don't quite realize how obsessed it is. And it's because I was raised Mormon. And like anytime you send off for one of those DNA testing kits, I actually think you should be very careful about where those come from. Because a huge number of those are being supplied by Mormons, and they are absolutely keeping your records and baptizing you once you're dead. So just be aware of that. So, I grew up in a situation where we would go and reenact pioneer stuff like all the time. And growing up, there was always this really interesting wariness to it because my parents, we were very invested in it. My mother was, but my dad was always kind of like, this is like not really what happened. It wasn't quite the way they're portraying. And there was that tension between my parents, which was really fascinating to me from a young age. So I'll give an example. So on one side of my family, my mother's, we are descended from polygamists. And so every year we would go to this polygamist family reunion where we were actually segregated at the reunion by which wife you were descended from. And you would sit at different tables. And so we were from the fourth wife, which was he was one of the prophets of the LDS church. She was like the young wife. And so we would go and we would sit at that cluster of tables. And there was real animosity between the descendants of these wives. Like if you came from the fourth wife, you would always be like, well, she's the one that he loved most because she was young and vibrant and she would travel with him on all of his tours and, and the other wives would be like, well, I was the first wife, or I was the one that he wanted to marry, but he had to get to second. And even when I was like 10 years old, the opening invocational prayer of this old woman thanked God for our noble blood. And as a kid, I was like, what does that mean? And my dad was like, don't listen to her. she's insane. But my mom was like, well, we have noble blood. Anyway, so this tension in history where I was, even at a very young age, being exposed to like good and bad and conflicting perspectives of history was just fascinating to me. And so historical games are that. And so in a way, they're me working through my own intergenerational trauma, that none of these are real history. There's no such thing as real history. There's only relayed history. There's the stories that we tell about history. And I'm fascinated at the ways that board games are uniquely suited to present that history and help us pick through it, but that it's very difficult and always imperfect. And that's what's so exciting to me about historical games. So maybe a little bit like Liz, like this is something that we can argue about, even if it's just your parents disagreeing and getting kind of snitty with each other.
I like that notion of, there not being a definitive history. There's certainly things that are less reliable than other stories, I suppose. But it's always tough to kind of advocate for that as a designer of historical games, because it just makes it sound like I don't take the research portion of that endeavor very seriously, when in actuality, I guess...
No, you take it more seriously if you're willing to accept that you don't have all the answers. Because if you took it too seriously, then you think that memorizing dates and facts makes you a historian, when it certainly the F does not. Like, anybody can memorize facts. It takes a historian to look at a dead person's mail, a random picture somewhere, and like a necklace, and try to make something out of that. Like,
yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think sometimes too, like the material that we have left behind to research certain topics, it's like a bit thinner on the ground than some designers would be comfortable with. And so as a result, like it's a little bit more about trying to weave a story through the artifacts that are left. Pax Penning comes up in this sense like a lot. Some of the Levy and campaign games that Volko has done. I mean, just like the texts that are available, they're not considerable. You know what I mean? Like it's not like this wealth of, I want to go day by day for, the following, battles of World War II or something like that. I just want to trudge through Stalingrad and like immerse myself in all that text. Like there's just not the same volume of support materials for that stuff. And then also it's fun to just sometimes get get a little bit, just as the researcher, like it's fun sometimes to hear a bullshit story and then see what it can inform about your game, which sounds a little silly, but like Salvador Dali's biography, he tells this little anecdote about pushing a child off of a bridge to their death, which didn't happen.
I remember that part.
Also, there's a person telling a lie about pushing a child off a bridge. Well, we're learning something about that person regardless, even if we're not learning the thing that they aim to tell us, right?
Yeah,
it's telling too, right? Because like, remember, like, was it 6 months to a year ago when there was suddenly everyone was like, I think about the Roman Empire every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was just so clear that like, no, you don't. You think about how much you liked Ridley Scott's Gladiator. Like, you're not thinking about Rome every day. You're thinking about a really fun movie, because none of you people exhibit any understanding of Rome. So but you are thinking about something every day, and it's this fictional construct of what you think Rome was, but is really like revolutionary America, and Ridley Scott like inserting some message into like his fantasy version of Rome. Like, to me, it's not just that that's inaccurate. It's that that's fascinating, that so many people really think they're thinking about ancient Rome every day. And they're just not. They're thinking about fantasy Rome. And that too, like, to me, that's also a texture of history, that in a way, what they're doing is just like a less honest version of what historians are doing, where historians are like, well, we're also thinking about a fantasy Rome. It's just that we're trying to ground it in like texts and archaeological record and trying to get closer and closer to what may have actually happened. Whereas you just really like that scene in Gladiator where they like make a chariot flip over. Like, that was sick.
So I'm answering down here, but I actually do think about Rome every day.
I know, Liz, that's the thing. I do too. When that meme came out, I was like, I felt a little attacked because I was like, no, I do think about Rome every day. And my fantasy of Rome is way closer than you normies who are thinking
I got
about
upset
Ridley
because it was
Scott.
presented as a masculine trait. Like even on the that Saturday Night Live video about guys being like Rome, ancient Rome. Like one that was actually hilarious, but I was so mad that the women were into astrology. What the F do I care about astrology? Like
That's true.
Rome.
You know, I was fascinated by it though, Liz. So I did poll like I became insufferable for a little while. Like every game night, everyone knew. I was like, do you think about Rome? And the number of men who said yes was higher than the number of women in my life, which is probably a self-selecting thing that Nosferatu here. I know a lot of dudes who think they're thinking about Rome and not so many women. But it was interesting to, you know, bug my friends about that for a month. Cole, you can think about chariots.
About Rome very much, but
chariots are sick, dude.
Hey, look, whatever happens between you and a chariot is your business, man. We celebrate it. Love is love.
Love is love. I think more of Age of Sail ships probably than chariots, generally speaking. So I'm definitely thinking about Master and Commander more. The film
Hornblower,
more than
baby.
I'm thinking about ancient Rome, like for sure.
Well, you're not out there thinking about the Corvus and like the superior Carthaginian ships.
Oh, I love a good Corvus, though. Absolutely. So many ways.
If Jon Grufford brings back Horatio Hornblower, I'm done. Like, oh, I watch Horatio Hornblower complete set every year.
I need to do that.
And so I'm not thinking about real Age of Sail ships there, right? Like we should be aware of that.
Yeah, it's
but it's still awesome.
It's still awesome. Yeah, that's a good pandemic view.
All right, here's a question, Dan. What is your favorite fake Rome to think about?
Favorite fake?
Oh. It's clearly not Gladiator.
Oh, you are so good, Liz. You. Oh, Liz.
That's a great question.
You always know which levers to pull. You're so good at this. That is so hard. So you know, my background is about women in Christianity and my educational background. And so I spend so much time just thinking about like ecclesia. And you know, so my favorite fictional Rome to think about is the Rome where the ecclesia don't become male. And, you know, like I'm one of those people who the evidence to me seems pretty much out that like Hebrews was not written by a woman, but I really like that theory. So, you know, to the Hebrews has always been attributed to Paul, but it's anonymous and it's just openly anonymous, right, in the New Testament. And there was a theory there for a while that it may have been written by a woman, which would help explain its anonymity. Because it isn't pseudepigrapha. It isn't trying to pretend to be somebody. It's not a forgery. It's just anonymous. And why would it be anonymous? Well, there are other reasons other than it being a woman, but I love that Rome, like this Rome where women are creating the what we come to think of as Christianity and also writing this really informative document. And that's a fictional Rome. Like I think it was like a year and a half ago, there was a really great article that I think pretty much put the nail in the coffin that Hebrews was written by Priscilla. But I loved that Rome. Like that Rome is really precious to me, that may have been written by a woman, and that women may have played more of a role. I mean, they certainly played more of a role than is acknowledged, but that I was like, maybe they played all the roles. So that's my favorite Rome. That's largely fictional. How about you, Liz? Boomerang.
Oh, I'm much more basic than that. I love I, Claudius. I love it so much. It's my favorite show. It's like my Horatio Hornblower. And I love it because I love Livia. Because so a powerful woman, but mine is absolutely willing to murder people. But my favorite thing about being a teacher and showing I Claudius was that my students would start out hating Livia, and then by the end, we would all be really sad in the episode where she dies because they came to understand like why she was so compelling, even if she was also evil. At least as the show presents her, right? And so I just love that entire arc. I love all the craziness of Julio Claudians, and also I have beef with I Claudius because I think they gave Agrippina the Younger a really unfair depiction. And so one of my personal missions is to eventually fix that because Agrippina is a boss.
Dan Bullock, what's your favorite fictional Rome?
That would be too tough.
You can just say Gladiator.
Yeah, it's okay, especially now that Denzel's part of it.
It's not. I haven't seen the second one. Like I
haven't either.
I don't know.
It's terrible, except
it's really
for looking at Denzel. Like,
I kind of think it might actually be a game version of Fake Rome in a weird way, because after we all interact with one another, we just create this weird, just kind of bad shit sandbox essentially that doesn't reflect any of the source material. So I don't know. It might actually just be something like Time of Crisis, where it's just a lot of treachery and folks getting slaughtered left and right, and you can definitely feel at the table. I feel like during a game of Time of Crisis, that's like 47 emperors killed in a 50-year period.
Yeah,
and I remember telling my nephews when I'm teaching them to play this game, it's like the leading cause of death is Praetorian Guard. That would be like if the leading cause of death for presidents was their Secret Service. Like that is essentially what is taking them out. So it's just like, I think that would be my Fake Rome play box of choice for the most part. And it's a delightful game that I still enjoy playing. I don't think about history too much for that. But yeah. And not to be bringing it back to games, Dan and Liz.
Yeah,
but I feel
I was going to be like, I just remembered we're supposed to be talking about this year's games. Like, but I didn't play a Roman game this year, so I can't really.
Yeah, I think the last one I probably played was Derek Emperors, right?
Yeah,
and that was the year before, wasn't it? That was good.
Yeah, actually, so. Speaking of games, I managed to go make a list. So Hispania did come out this past year. That was fun. If you like Tetrarchia, that kind of like pandemic style, cooperative Rome games. So that one,
I should look into that.
I liked it because it took that Tetrarchia formula, and instead of making it feel pandemic-y, you're actually trying to take over Spain. And so instead of keeping the bad guys out, well, I don't think barbarians are bad guys, but that's another matter. You are the bad guy encroaching in.
Girl, same.
But one thing I want to say is kind of striking about this year is that one of my favorite quote historical games wasn't historical at all because it was Red Dust Rebellion. That was an absolutely kick-ass coin game. So,
super good. And it's fascinating. You're onto something so cool there, Liz, because you know what? 2 of the 3 coin games this year were not like historical. Because Vijaya Nagara is, but it's also from a period where we're like, we kind of know what happened. But Red Dust Rebellion is really good historical modeling of something that never happened. But so is Fred's game, right? A Just of Robin Hood. That's because it's like this amalgamation of like every Robin Hood theory and folktale, and it's also not historical. So sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'm just adding. I agree with you. So follow that tangent.
No, I feel like we've like hit a true vein, right? Actually, Vijaya Nagara was also on my list of games that were worth talking about this year because I really liked it. So lots of like but irregular conflicts is like starting to move, right? Like I'm very excited about that. But the other thing I noticed is I'm always checking David's games because I know what my friends put out, right? But the Undaunted this year was a sci-fi game as well because it was Callisto. And so I think that we're seeing kind of an interesting era starting maybe where people are using some of the work that's been done in historical gaming and then reapplying it to fictional worlds kind of in ways that like, if you look at something like Oath, right, from Leader. So like Cole loves to kind of take historical inspiration and turn it into fantasy gaming that's more commercial. You could also see it obviously in Root. You can see it in arcs. It's a space opera, but it's got stuff to say. And so I feel like that is becoming a more normal thing to do. So you see something like Red Dust Rebellion, where it's the first coin game that's just really going wild on sci-fi stuff. I think that's awesome. Undaunted has reached sci-fi. David, I don't know if this is true, but I feel like it could be true that there could be like a Resist game that's about like sci-fi or hackers or something coming someday. So I don't know. I just kind of feel like those lessons that we're learning about historical modeling are also making our fictional worlds and games more interesting, or will be doing so.
I wonder what it's saying.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dan.
I was about to say why I think that is, which is I think this is like the year of Mars. Because it's not only that, like Mike Duncan, who does the Roman Revolutions podcast, is doing a theoretical fictional like series on a Martian revolution. Maybe it's just really up in my grill because I've been also rereading Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, which is about a Martian revolution. But I love science fiction. I read way more science fiction than history because I'm a nerd of a different stripe, I guess. But to me, science fiction is always speaking to like what our cultural anxieties are right now. So these stories that are very much about like a modern revolution and what that would look like, I think are speaking to something we're maybe feeling an undercurrent of right now.
So I actually also want to take this and I want to yes and you and I want to push it because this is actually a conversation that's been happening in book world. So I'll look at what's happening on BookTube or Book Talk and then just wait for it to be applicable to games. So I think it already is. So there have been several arguments among book reviewers on TikTok and stuff this year about, I just want to enjoy my books. Why are you making them political? And they'll be like, oh yeah, this isn't political at all. The Hunger Games. Oh yeah, this isn't political at all. Like Redwall. Yeah. And so I also feel like we are maybe learning to be more explicitly political in our fictional games instead of pretending that they're not. If that makes sense. I don't know. Yeah. I feel like we're moving back into a direction where it's okay to use fiction to talk about real things, as opposed to like, oh, look at this cute game that isn't political at all, and it's just pure good Christian fun. And I'm really sort of glad to see us getting messy again, or at least admitting that that's what we want to do.
It's really interesting to see how. So a couple of things that like noted like in the games that both of you brought up. One is seeing systems from historical games being incorporated to non-historical topics is kind of fascinating to me because I never think of historical games as being cutting edge mechanically. Like I just don't think that that's usually like an innovative push like within the hobby. Like I think the strength of historical games in their designs is often about, thematic resonance, right? Like having thematic mechanisms and like kind of creating like an experience in that way. And so when I see the mechanisms of say coin pushing like a non-historical topic, to me, it's more about there's a sense they can see that the story is fused, like that there's a rich narrative in this game and it's fused with these mechanisms. So then they're pulling those mechanisms and trying to apply them to something else, which is really interesting because they know that the story is like having some fusion between those two things is important. But it's a weird place sometimes to borrow the mechanism. And the other thing I was noting was when we were talking about Fred's game, like just a Robin Hood, it made me think a little bit of how like the different versions of Robin Hood incorporated in that game made me think a little bit about how in Pendragon, there's sort of a strange aura around that game where Arthurian legend has this role in it, despite the fact, like if we're looking at like what history actually transpired, that's always a little weird from a player perspective. It can be a bit jarring when it's like, well, this person is a fictional figure, not a historical. You know what I mean? Like I think Dan, you brought that up for like PAX Premiere too. Like it'd be like this is a character. This is not like a real person. Like sometimes we have these games where there's like fictional characters that have some sort of occupy some space within the model. It's like a little bit
Harry Flashman.
It's like fuzzy, yeah, like kind of a fuzziness within like kind of the history or the context of the game.
Well, one thing I love, so Cole is, if we're being pedantic, I was talking to somebody and they're like, well, he's not a historian, he's a literary guy. And I was like, oh, those are like the same thing.
Yeah. Oh,
but
I hate that. Like, don't do that.
like they may come at it from a slightly different angle. But one of the things that I love about like Harry Flashman appearing in Pax Pamir is just this acknowledgement that fiction is history. That like your fictional characters that are being written about, that you've got this kind of adventure guy, like the existence of fiction is sending young men on adventures, right? Like it is serving a cultural function to say like, well, we wrote books about like the fun adventures we were having, and Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden, and some people took it one way and some people took it another way, but either way it is still part of the texture of what is going on. Literature and the fiction, they're telling people how to contextualize the time they're in, which therefore becomes our history. And so I love the inclusion of Harry Flashman and Pax Pamir, as he shows up and suddenly this fictional character is acting as though he were a governor or a chieftain or a slave market. And to me, I'm going, well, isn't he a tangible reality, even if he isn't a physical person, because he's still influencing people and making things happen. And Cole, I think, because he comes from the literary side as opposed to like the strict history side, I think it allows him to blur those lines in a way that some like strict historians are always a little wary of. But at least that's my read. I think like the whole, is he really a historian? I think in some ways, like coming at it from the literary perspective gives him certain really powerful advantages.
Yeah. I mean, and you know how this is, Dan, like when you're doing ancient religion stuff, it's like, okay, can I look at a Greek novel and try to understand culture? Yes. Can I look at, a poem that may or may not be about a real love affair? Yes. Do I think that these stories about monks making alligators burst in the Nile, crocodiles explode in the Nile or whatever, like, do I think that that's literally true? No, this is like, maybe the Avengers for ancient Christians or something like that. So, I think that trying too hard to only look at history, like the other thing is like historians of the ancient world were quite prone to some like tall tales. And so, the further back in time you go, the messier that distinction gets. And I don't think that's the point. Like, I think that if you read a novel from our lifetimes in a 500 years, you're going to learn a lot about our culture from reading the novel, even if the novel is not historical.
Yeah,
I think that's what you're going to learn.
Well, like, in the study of women in early Christianity, like, do you want to understand the mentality of these people? Well, you read Thecla, right? The Acts of Paul and Thecla. And you can't really understand Thecla unless you're reading genre novels from that time and recognizing the way that this story about Thecla is riffing on Hellenistic motifs, right? That like this is a genre that's super common, that other people that Christians are now appropriating and writing themselves into it. And that is it's a negotiated conversation between cultures in collision, and it's as real as, early Christians being persecuted, which, by the way, much of that is also mythologized, right?
Oh, like,
and so the fiction is the reality for people. So leaving that out, I think, is a huge mistake. Modern history, I think, actually to its detriment, often prioritizes like history as it was. So in like New Testament scholarship right now, there's this huge push of originalism. And it's good, right? Like trying to figure out like, what did the text mean originally? And I think there's obvious value in that. But the originalists often run into this clash with receptionists, receptionists are like, well, right, but just because, that text means that literally, but what about to the plight of like Southern Black people, in the Jim Crow era, who are obviously reading these texts in a way that is not originalist, but is very liberatory and meaningful. That those meanings are every bit as real as the original meaning. Both of them have been set aside, and both of them are important to the people who lived them in their time and place. And I think a good historical game can, like Red Dust Rebellion or like Pax Pamir or like Pax Penning, which also intersects a little bit with this notion of like state building and like what story are these people choosing to tell about themselves. That is history. History is fiction, and rather than being a limitation, that is a strength because it's a story that we are telling about ourselves, and board games are really good at tapping into that.
Yes.
And so I like to see more of that. Maybe to that point, can I bring up another game that I actually think was one of the best history games of the year, but I think almost
and then I
none
want to
of us
ask you an annoying question.
Okay, Liz, you're so good at this, but write it down because I want to hear your annoying question. So one of my favorite history games of the year is a game that I didn't even think of as a history game until very recently, and it's Kurt Vonnegut's GHQ.
Oh, yeah.
And it's more of a history game in the sense that here we have this basically an original text now brought to light, thanks to Jeff Engelstein, so Kurt Vonnegut, after his like first novel, before he hit it big, he made a board game that is a chess kind of level abstraction of World War II, like artillery combat, basically. And he tried to publish it. It didn't pan out. And so he ended up just shelving it. And eventually, just this last year, thanks to Jeff Engelstein, who brought it in, modernized it a little bit, sorted through his notes to try to figure out which version was the most workable. Now we have a release that is showing up in like Barnes and Noble that is Kurt Vonnegut's. Basically, it's fascinating because just like you can look at chess and see these inklings of like, okay, well, here's how they understood, pawns, because that game is insanely political. The very fact that pawns are always sacrificed, the way that knights move, the priority of the king, who he loses by being trapped, but he's also kind of useless, speaks to something, right? The same thing is happening in GHQ, where I think GHQ, from our modern perspective, is just an okay game. But from the perspective of the time and place that it was designed, I think it's incredible. Because Kurt Vonnegut is effectively inventing like multiple action phases per round. Units have asymmetrical attack styles. It's really quite forward-thinking for when he designed it. And so here we have an actual historical artifact that through basically chance has been transported forward 60 years-ish. And we can experience it now and basically do primary history just by playing it and reading the wonderful notes that that Engelstein has given to us from Vonnegut's notebooks. So I think that's one of the best history games of the year because it's a primary document that's just been teleported to us. That is bananas and so cool.
I like that. Yes. Okay. So my annoying question. I think it might be too soon to tell, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Which is, so when we talk about games really tapping into something, and like games themselves, like if a novel is a historical artifact, right? A game is also a historical artifact. So if you were looking at games of the last couple of years, especially, I think historical games are doing really well compared with historical games from, let's say, 5 to 7 years ago. What would you, looking back on that evidence, read into our subculture?
Oh my gosh.
Do you want me to filibuster for you, Dan?
Yeah.
You can have an opinion too.
I want to hear this. I want to hear you.
You just punt it.
Go Dan B.
I was going to say, I've seen a rise in the amount of games about insurrection and insurgency in the past few years, post-COVID, and I think that's for various different reasons. I think that I've also noticed some trends within, on one end of gaming, there historical games specifically, but on one end, there's been a lot more of a sensitivity about having players occupy the role of colonizers, playing the role of the unsavory and doing all the terrible deeds, while there's a more cooperative approach to being the colonized in those situations, like really changing the player POV. However, at the same time, we're now seeing there were once topics within historical games that were considered pretty taboo that most people would not have wanted to design. And we're seeing a few companies and designers decide, well, I'm going to do it anyway. So now I feel like there's been a little bit more of a kind of reactionary swing in the other direction. So for every, kind of Spirit Island successor or, kind of Land and Freedom like game, you've got the other side of the hill, which is NAC Games, Nazi high command, essentially like German high command in a bunker somewhere. And I don't know, like the model's all over the place because there's a competitive version, a cooperative version, a solitaire version. So all of those games are modeling something sort of different and saying something different, which, but yeah, that's a game that I wouldn't have thought would get released previously or that a publisher would necessarily publish. But I'm seeing more of these kind of games like that don't have share that same sensitivity as the other wing of the hobby. And then simultaneously, we've got our usual kind of lost cause, alt history, Confederates and mechs and other nonsense going on, like on the other end of the hobby. And even some of the games too, like something like Purple Haze, which I don't think is necessarily super insensitive or sensitive. Not a commentary about whether or not these games should be made, but there's definitely like a difference in approach that I'm seeing. Like it's almost like two different trends kind of emerging from the past couple of years.
Yeah.
I'll actually tie that to, like, I think in some ways we're all kind of living the change in our hobby, which is maybe why we don't think about it as much. But every single fight that people have been having the last few years about what is a war game, what counts, what should be nominated for a war game award versus a not, especially as like our hobbies evolving, like, so war and historical games are borrowing from more mainstream hobby mechanisms now, which I think is really good. I think it makes the games better. As we talked about it too, right now people are kind of dipping into historical models to talk about fiction. And so like it just continues to muddy the waters, right, of like what is a war game, but it's also a conversation about who counts, who's part of our culture, like who gets to have a say about what gets nominated for an award, who should be considered qualified to talk about these things. I think that we are currently in the midst of a negotiation about all that.
Yeah.
In response to some of the changes that Dan's been talking about.
And to thank you for filibustering. I mean, I think that, so first of all, I think that Liz's question might be a little bit unanswerable. And I think Liz would agree, right? Like you can't see the history you're in very clearly until it's past. And then it becomes unclear in a very different way. But, I agree with you that I think that we've seen some really interesting changes even this year. So last year, for instance, Rungazis' The British Way, I think is a very tonally different coin game from the coin games that Volko instantiated with like Ende and Abyss. Where you play some of those early coin games, and obviously you had individual volumes that had very nuanced perspectives on like these insurgency movements. But there was also, in many cases, like this reluctance to come out and like agree with Marxists or communists. Whereas you play something like The British Way, and it's pretty clear where its sympathies lie. And the same is true of, Red Dust Rebellion, where the Marsgov and the Corp are so in each other's pockets. The same is true of some other games that we played this year, right? Like Chicago 68, Striking Flint, which is about another form of insurgency, that we are seeing a pretty hard change, I think, toward sympathizing with subaltern populations or oppressed workers or unions. Even, I think there's also the question of how did we get here is a big pressing question right now in historical wargaming. So we saw that, for instance, British Way, the first in that multi-pack was Palestine. Like, how did we get here to this current problem that we're facing? And so we have this 1 hour coin game that's pretty much just like, okay, here's one major step in how we got to our current expression of Gaza, right? And you see the same thing in, for instance, Arabian Struggle, which is very much like, okay, how did this House of Saud become this major political force in the modern world, when no one could have seen that coming as it was occurring? I think that these games are very directly interested in like expressing our own unwritten history. How did we get into our current pickle? Chicago 68, Arabian Struggle, Striking Flint, they are all trying to answer that question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm also
Liz.
going to point out you get the other side pushback where you get something like Compass's 2040 coming out as like a cute tongue-in-cheek joke about like that topic, but from the other end in terms of perspective. But I actually think that when you talk about it that way, right, it's absolutely no surprise that somebody would design that game and sell it, because it's still kind of gnawing on the same problem, just from a perspective that I think I probably find pretty alien.
Maybe in a more kind of exploitative way, right? Sort of like Alex Garland's Civil War, where it's just like we get there and like you don't really have anything to comment on it. You just kind of want to press this button. Which is, when I was a kid, like my sister and I, we got a Light Bright, and the first thing we did was write cuss words in it. Because we just wanted to see them in lights. And it was promptly taken away. So my speech, I'm used to having this chip on my shoulder where my speech feels limited, even when I don't have anything particularly silly to say.
Well, like, and there is some nuance there. So like, one game that I wrote about this year, but I don't think is out until next year, was Anoda, by Paco Gradaya. And that it's a really good game and it's very compelling. And I interviewed Paco, and one of the things I asked him, because this game could absolutely be read as a nationalist fascist game, because Hiro Onoda himself has kind of become this figure of renown in like the Japanese nationalist movement, right? That and in talking to Paco, one of the questions I asked him was like, well, how would you feel if fascists read your game as being sympathetic to their cause? And his answer was, I would cry, because he doesn't want it to be read that way. His perspective is very nuanced, but the sense I get from him philosophically and some of the answers he gave is that he doesn't really want to editorialize too much within the game. Which, obviously I have a difference of opinion there, but I can respect that he's designing from his own perspective. And Anoda is a fascinating game. I really like a lot of what it's doing. And it to me, it reads like a tragedy, right? That this person on an island is going to continue a war for decades when he was absolutely the pawn in chess, right? Like just thrown into the grinder. None of his superiors care about him. And so this game is about self-deception, and it ends up being kind of about social media bubbles almost. And I think it's a fascinating game, but it is prone to like, I think that Paco might be engaging in some unconscious reactionary thought himself, but he wants to make it into like, he wants to comment on it in a certain way, but he doesn't quite know how. And I think we're going to be untangling that for a long time to come. But just a fascinating game. And so I think absolutely we're seeing both of those textures, as well as people in the middle who are trying to do good work, and are kind of swimming in these currents that are a little bit beyond any one individual.
Well, those are great points. I notice we have a few minutes left, and I wanted to leave a little time to allow the audience to ask some questions. So if there are any questions among you that you'd like to address to both Liz and Dan, then we can get their thoughts
and you
their input.
And Dan B.
Both Dans.
I'll answer a question that I saw earlier. So Molotov Cockatiel asked a great question when I was talking about GHQ being a primary source, where I'll have to scroll it, but he said something like, can't any game that models the conflict of the area be considered history? Yes. I think one of the unique advantages of GHQ, as opposed to something like Hit the Beach, from like 1965 about the Pacific War, is first of all, Hit the Beach was not designed with any notion of like expressionistic intent, where I think we actually can learn a little bit about like island hopping, from Hit the Beach. But what I think is unique about GHQ is we have somebody who is famously introspective, creating a game in which I think this is actually a legitimate way of him working through his wartime experience, just as much as writing Slaughterhouse-5, right? And they might move in different directions, but GHQ still speaks to a lot of really interesting realities of World War II, like the nature of just artillery warfare, the absolute power, but also vulnerability of airborne troops, the way that infantry are kind of used a little bit disposably by certain commanders, Patton. And I think it's valuable to look at that not only as a time capsule, but one that has come to us instantaneously as opposed to gradually. Like, so that's part of my excitement with it, is a game like Hit the Beach. We've had, a long time to internalize what it's trying to say. GHQ, I think if we pay attention to GHQ and take it seriously, I think there's a lot to pull out of it that may not meet the eye right away. So that's kind of the value. But yes, I would say yes, every game written or created in its time period is a time capsule in some way. So yeah.
It's certainly a time capsule for the designer, right, Liz?
Yeah, actually, I sort of feel, I was joking with somebody earlier today, like I'm literally a working game designer who currently has nothing to show for it because none of my stuff is actually
4
out.
years when that happens.
And so, I'm in this space where like I feel like everything in my design life is like in a state of being about to happen. But that's also a fun place to be because I don't know how my career will develop. Like if the projects I'm planning now will happen the way I think they will, what they'll lead to naturally. I think that I'll look back in 10 years and then in 20 and be like, that's really interesting. Looking back historically at people and how they understand this. Actually, David and I were laughing about this morning. So like, okay. First, I said I wasn't a war gamer in 2018. I was like, I don't really consider myself that. And then like, oh God, like we were just wrong about ourselves sometimes, right? Like you look back and you're like, damn, I really misread myself. And actually, the year David and I started working on Night Witches, I had done a podcast with Ricky Royal that February where he encouraged me to start designing stuff and just tinkering with games. And I was like, oh, nah, I'll never do that. I'm just a reviewer. 6 months later, total change. And I think that it's actually kind of fun to look back even now, right, and think about how much my life has changed because I decided to just go with something that I didn't think that I would end up doing. But even that choice, like my whole life is a totally different life now, and I'm very curious about what I'll look back at Night Witches and think about in 10 years. Will people play it? I'll never be a millionaire either, David. I'm making money. I'll do that. Wait. But
I don't set your sights higher, Liz. You could just say billionaire because I'm pretty sure billionaires work according to Highlander rules, where you kill it, you keep it.
I thought you meant in the end there can only be one.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah. Well, I like this idea of sending them to Mars. I just want them to leave their stuff here when they go.
Yeah, you can't take it with you. Is like a really good about it.
No, it's gonna be amazing, Liz, to see the fruits of your efforts and the games you're collaborating with, like David, with like to see them come out. But one of the things that's very odd about it is that people are commenting on an effort that's like a couple of years you're a bit removed from in a weird way.
Yes.
Because you're so in that next project. And so it almost feels like they're just commenting on how you spent your 2021 or 2022 sometimes. And it's interesting because it's like an odd bookmark or like mile marker in your life, but it's also very difficult for me personally to, like, to take any kind of criticism too personally, because it's also like, oh, that's old. Like, I did that a while ago. I'm on to something else now. I'm doing something else. So you never really internalize the criticism or the praise too much, because you just don't know if you're 3 years further into the weeds or 3 years on the trajectory of building on your own design kind of chops. Yeah. But no. Well, we are at 102. So I want to be thoughtful of other people's time. I know we've got a bunch of other overlapping events and things of that nature, but I wanted to thank Dan and Liz for joining us and discussing their favorite games of 2024 with very few digressions. Dan, you never get us into the weeds, and I really appreciate that. You always keep us right on the straight and narrow. It's fantastic.
I'm sorry. War Story Occupied France was also good. It was also on my list. I'm so sorry I didn't say it.
Yes, Striking Flint had been on mine, so I'm glad that you brought it up. I also did bring up I, Napoleon.
We're bad at this.
So it was a fun one this year.
We'll get them next year. That's all right.
Yeah.
No worries.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your con.